A thin 27-year-old woman, with tangled dark brown hair, stood in the last row of a livestock auction in rural Kentucky. A thin 27-year-old woman, with tangled dark brown hair, stood in the last row of a livestock auction in rural Kentucky, her trembling hand lifting a crumpled $2 bill to buy a dying mare that no one else would even bother to look at. The horse was nothing but skin and bone, its coat falling out in patches, its eyes clouded white like milk, standing there shivering in the middle of the auction floor, as if it were waiting for someone to finally end its pain. People laughed. They called her a fool. They said that horse was only worth turning into glue. But Josie Wynn didn't see a dying horse. She saw a mark branded into its left shoulder, half hidden beneath mud and matted hair, a stylized lily inside a circle, and everything inside her froze. She had seen that symbol exactly once in her life, on the only jewelry box her mother had left behind before vanishing without a word 20 years ago, when Josie was only 7 years old. Her father had kept that box locked in a drawer for the rest of his life, and had never said a single word about it. He had carried that secret to his grave 6 months ago. Now, amid the smell of horse manure and the mocking laughter of the crowd, that secret was standing right in front of her, starved down to bone and blind, but still alive. That $2 horse wasn't an accident. It was the final piece of a puzzle her mother had tried to bury. And when Josie pulled that thread, it would lead her straight to the door of an underground empire no one could enter and still expect to walk back out. So if you want to know how that dying horse brought a woman with nothing face to face with the most powerful mafia boss in the American South, stay with this story until the very end. Hit like to support the channel so it can keep telling stories like this. Share this video with a friend you know won't be able to stop watching halfway through. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment. The man at the auction counter tossed her the rope attached to the rotting bridle and turned his back as if he had just unloaded a burden. Josie held the rope, feeling the weight of the horse at the other end, much lighter than she had imagined. The blind mare stood still, head lowered, her wheezing breath spilling out in thin bursts of mist into the late afternoon air. Josie didn't have a truck. She had sold her father's old pickup 2 months earlier to pay the last of the hospital bills, the final debt Paul Wynn had left behind for her, along with the locked jewelry box and a sentence that had never been explained. She didn't have a horse trailer either, didn't have a barn, didn't have anything except the mobile trailer at the edge of town and the $2 she had just spent, so she did the only thing she could do. She led the horse home on foot, 4 miles along the 2-lane road that ran from the auction house back to the trailer park. The horse walked slowly, 1 step at a time, its cracked hooves clicking against the asphalt. It staggered at the first bend, its front legs buckling before it forced itself upright again. And Josie had to stop, stand there, and wait, keeping the rope loose in her hand so the horse wouldn't feel pulled. She didn't hurry it. She didn't know when she had begun to understand what it felt like for a creature to be used to being rushed forward when its legs no longer wanted to move. But she understood. They stopped 3 times along the way. The first time beside the dry ditch by the road when the horse's breathing grew too heavy. The second time in the empty lot in front of the abandoned Baptist church, when its hind legs trembled so badly Josie was afraid it would fall. The third time right in front of the trailer park gate, when the horse froze, ears pricked, nose drawing in the air as if trying to read a world it couldn't see. Josie waited. She waited every time, and every time, the horse chose to move forward on its own, without anyone pulling. The trailer park sat on the eastern edge of town, 12 mobile trailers lined up in 2 rows on a gravel lot, separated by spaces wide enough to hang laundry and narrow enough to hear everything the neighbors said. Josie's trailer stood at the end of the row, the smallest, the oldest, its white paint yellowed with age and the tarp roof over the porch torn at one corner since last winter. She led the horse around back, to a patch of empty ground about half the size of a basketball court, where weeds grew up to the knees. She tied the rope to an old fence post, dragged a blue tarp out of the little shed, and stretched it into a makeshift shelter. Not a stable, not a proper place for any living creature, but it could keep off the rain. And tonight, it might rain. Josie carried a plastic bucket to the water spigot behind the trailer, filled it, brought it out, and set it at the horse's feet. The mare lowered its head, its muzzle touching the surface of the water, then stopped. It didn't drink. It only stood there, its nose touching the water, as if checking whether the water was real or just another promise that would be taken away. Then it drank. Slowly, 1 small swallow at a time, stopping, lifting its head, listening, then lowering its head to drink again. As if it had learned that every good thing could disappear at any moment, so it was better not to drink too much at once. Josie sat down on the trailer steps, both hands resting on her knees, and watched the horse drink in the fading evening light. 6 months since her father had closed his eyes in a hospital bed, she had been living like a clock with a dead battery, still hanging on the wall, but with hands that didn't move. Working the night shift at the diner, coming home, sleeping, waking, repeating. Not sad, not happy, not anything at all, just existing, drifting through one day after another like water slipping through her fingers. But now, sitting on the steps and watching the blind, bone-thin mare drink from a cheap plastic bucket, Josie felt something surge up in her chest. Not hope. She had lost the ability to hope a long time ago. This was sharper, hotter, like a needle piercing through the numbness she had wrapped around herself for the past half-year. It was the need to know, to understand, to find out why the mark on this horse's shoulder was exactly the same as the mark on the box her mother had left behind before disappearing from Josie's life 20 years ago. Josie looked at the horse. The horse couldn't look back, but its ears turned toward her, listening to her breathing as darkness came down. "I'll call you Ghost," Josie said, her voice rough because she hadn't spoken to anyone all day. "Because you look like something that came back from the dead." The horse gave a small toss of its head, then lowered its muzzle, and took another swallow of water. And Josie sat there, on the steps of the cheapest trailer in the trailer park, watching a $2 horse drink beneath a torn tarp, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt awake. Josie called the veterinarian at 6 o'clock the next morning, as soon as the sky was light enough for her to see that Ghost was still standing beneath the tarp. Head lowered, her heavy breathing carrying that steady rasp like wind pushing through a broken doorframe. She found the number in the old yellow phone directory her father had left in the kitchen drawer, flipped to the veterinary page, and called the first number that said it accepted horse cases. The person who answered was Dr. Greer. Her voice sounded like someone who had just drunk black coffee with no sugar and had no intention of drinking anything sweeter for the rest of the day. She asked for the address, asked about the animal's condition, and said she would be there within an hour. She didn't ask whether Josie had enough money to pay. Maybe she had heard enough in Josie's voice to know the answer. Dr. Greer arrived exactly 57 minutes later, driving an old white truck with the bed loaded with tools, a stethoscope, medicine bottles, and things Josie couldn't name. She was a woman of about 55, with salt and pepper hair cut short against the nape of her neck, her face lined, but not with the kind of lines that came from smiling. These were the lines of someone who had spent a life looking straight at things other people didn't want to look at for too long. She stepped down from the truck, didn't say hello, didn't shake hands, only looked at the horse standing beneath the tarp, and walked straight toward her. Ghost lifted her head when she heard the unfamiliar footsteps, ears pricked, nose drawing in the air. Dr. Greer placed a hand on the horse's neck, and Ghost shuddered but didn't back away. Dr. Greer examined her in silence for nearly 10 minutes. She checked her teeth, lifted her eyelids to look at the white clouded pupils, pressed lightly against her hooves, listened to her lungs with the stethoscope, and ran her hand along the ribs rising sharply beneath the thin skin. Josie stood beside her, arms crossed over her chest, not asking, only watching. She knew how to read the faces of people who were thinking, and Dr. Greer's face right then didn't say anything good. When Dr. Greer pulled the stethoscope from her ears and turned to look at Josie, she didn't soften the truth. "Do you want me to be honest, or do you want me to be gentle?" Josie looked straight into her eyes. "I'm not paying to hear gentle." Dr. Greer nodded, as if that was the only answer she would have accepted. "Severe malnutrition, mild pneumonia, and it could get worse without treatment. Cracked hooves on all 4 legs, worse in the front. There's nothing to be done for the eyes. Could be an old injury, could be disease. But whatever caused it, the vision isn't coming back. This horse has been neglected for at least a full year, maybe longer." She stopped, looked at Ghost, then looked back at Josie. "I'll speak plainly. This horse should be released. You're pouring money into a body that hasn't agreed to lie down yet." The sentence hung in the air between them like cigarette smoke. Josie looked at Ghost. The horse stood there, her legs trembling faintly, her head tilted a little toward Josie, as if she were listening to the conversation that would decide her fate without understanding it. Her breathing was raspy, labored, but steady. Still steady. "She's still standing," Josie said. "That means she hasn't given up." Dr. Greer looked at her for a long time, not with pity, not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone trying to decide what kind of stubbornness this girl in front of her carried. The kind that led somewhere, or the kind that only led to more pain. Then she turned back to the truck and took out 2 bottles of medicine and a bag of white powder. Antibiotics, twice a day, mixed into water. Anti-inflammatory, once every evening. Mix this powder into her feed. It'll help her absorb nutrients better. Feed her small amounts, but often. Don't let her eat too much at once. Her stomach can't handle it. She placed everything in Josie's hands. I'll come back next week to check her. If she gets worse before then, call me. She climbed into the truck, then stopped, one hand on the door. You remind me of someone I used to know. Stubborn enough not to know when to let go. She closed the truck door and drove away without another word. Josie stood there with the 2 bottles of medicine and the bag of powder in her hands, watching Dr. Greer's truck disappear around the bend. Then she turned back to Ghost. The horse was still standing in the same place, ears turned toward her, waiting. Josie sat down beside her, her back against the fence post, and for the first time, she spoke to her not to give an order or call her name, but simply to speak. Where did you come from? She asked softly. Ghost didn't answer. She only turned her ears toward Josie's voice and breathed, steady, heavy, but still breathing. And Josie sat there beside her until the sun had fully risen, feeling the warmth from the horse's body nearby, and thinking that maybe this was the question she had to answer before any other. That night, Josie couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed inside the trailer, listening to Ghost's wheezing breath beyond the thin wall, and the question she had asked the horse that afternoon kept turning over and over in her mind, like a coin dropped on a wooden floor that refused to settle. Where did you come from? She knew the answer wasn't inside the horse. It was inside the very bottom drawer of the old wooden bedroom cabinet her father had brought with them from the old house when they moved into the trailer 6 years ago. The drawer was locked. Her father had kept the key on a cord around his neck, right beside the old dog tag he had never explained. When Paul Wynn lay in the hospital bed during his final days, the nurse had taken the cord from around his neck and handed it to Josie along with his leather wallet, his watch, and the wedding ring worn so thin it was almost transparent. Josie had put the key in a shoebox under the bed and hadn't touched it for 6 months. Not because she wasn't curious, but because she was afraid. Afraid that opening that drawer would open one more emptiness she didn't know how to fill. But tonight, after Dr. Greer had left and left behind 2 bottles of medicine, along with a sentence that kept gnawing inside her mind, Josie wasn't afraid of emptiness anymore. She was afraid of not knowing. She sat up, turned on the desk lamp, took the key from the shoebox, and sat down in front of the cabinet. The key slid smoothly into the lock, as if it had been opened many times before by the calloused hand of the man who had kept it close to his chest for 20 years. The drawer slid out. Inside, there was only one thing, a small jewelry box made of ebony, glossy black, heavier than its size suggested. Josie lifted it, placed it on her lap, and looked at the lid. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Carved deep into the wood on the lid was a stylized lily inside a circle. The same symbol, the same lines, the same way the petals curved to the left, identical to the mark branded on the left shoulder of the blind horse now standing and wheezing beyond the wall of her trailer. Josie opened the box. The hinge gave a soft creak, and the scent of old wood mixed with something faint, maybe perfume, maybe memory, rose up and touched her nose. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a thin gold necklace, so delicate it was almost invisible, with a tiny teardrop pendant. Josie lifted it and let it sway before her eyes in the yellow lamplight. She had never seen her mother wear this necklace. But then, she didn't remember much about her mother either. Only fragments. The smell of her hair when she bent down to kiss Josie's forehead before bedtime, laughter in the kitchen in the morning, and the feeling of her mother's hand holding hers when they crossed the street. Broken pieces of a woman Josie had never truly known. The second thing was a small photograph, about the size of her palm, printed on glossy paper that had yellowed at the edges. In the picture was a young woman, maybe 20 years old, with dark brown hair falling past her shoulders, wearing a white dress, standing in front of a large house. Not large in the ordinary way. It was the kind of house with white columns on the porch, with a lawn as wide as the entire trailer park where Josie lived, with a tall iron fence and an arched gate in the distance. The woman in the photograph was smiling, a wide, natural smile, the smile of someone standing in a place where she belonged. Josie recognized her as her mother, not because of memory, because her memories of her mother were only dim fragments, but because of the eyes, gray blue eyes exactly like the ones Josie saw every morning in the mirror. The eyes her father had avoided looking into during the last years of his life because they looked too much like his wife's. The third thing, at the bottom of the box, folded into a tiny square no bigger than the tip of a finger, was a piece of paper. Josie unfolded it. Handwriting. Thin strokes, slightly trembling at the end of each word, as if the person writing had been in a hurry, or afraid, or both. If you find this, don't go looking for answers. There are doors that can't be closed once they're opened. I love you. Forgive me. Josie read it 3 times, the first time quickly, her eyes swallowing the words, the second time more slowly, word by word, the third time the slowest, stroke by stroke, trying to imagine what hand had written these lines, in what room, at what hour, and what she had been thinking when she wrote the words, "Forgive me." Her hands shook. Not from the cold, because for 20 years, Josie had thought her mother had left because she hadn't wanted to stay. But people didn't write "Forgive me" when they wanted to leave. People wrote "Forgive me" when they had no other choice. Josie folded the paper carefully along its old creases, slipped it into the pocket of her bra, and sat there in the dark trailer, the open box on her lap, the gold necklace glimmering faintly in the lamplight, the photograph of the woman smiling in front of the large house lying on the floor beside her feet. Outside, Ghost wheezed steadily. The night wind stirred the tarp gently, and Josie spoke into the darkness, her voice rough but steady, as if her mother were standing somewhere in the corner of the room and could hear her. I was never good at listening, Mama. You knew that. Josie didn't know how long she sat on the trailer floor. Maybe 1 hour, maybe 3. The jewelry box was still open on her lap. The gold necklace curled in her left palm, her mother's handwritten note tucked inside her bra pocket against her skin, warming with her body heat as if it were alive. And in that dark space between night and morning, when Ghost's wheezing outside was the only sound in the world, Josie remembered the hospital. 6 months earlier. Room 412, 3rd floor, end-of-life care unit. Josie remembered the smell of antiseptic, the smell of sheets washed in industrial bleach, and another smell she didn't want to name but knew exactly what it was. The smell of someone slowly disappearing. Paul Wynn lay in the hospital bed, smaller than Josie had ever known him to be. Her father had been a mechanic, a man who had spent his life under other people's cars, his hands always stained with engine oil even after he washed them 3 times with soap, shoulders broad, back bent from too much stooping. But still solid, still steady, still the wall Josie leaned against whenever the world pushed too hard. But in that hospital bed, that wall had broken. Lung cancer had eaten him from the inside out for 8 months, and what remained on the white sheet then no longer looked like her father. His shoulder bones rose through the hospital gown like broken wings. His wrists were so thin Josie could wrap her fingers around them and touch her fingertips together. The mechanic's hands, the calloused hands that had turned thousands of bolts and lifted hundreds of tires, now lay on the bedsheet, thin as paper, blue veins standing out beneath skin that was almost transparent. But when Josie sat down beside the bed and placed her hand over her father's, Paul closed his fingers around it, tight. Tighter than that worn-down body should have been able to hold, and he opened his eyes. His eyes were cloudy yellow, the whites yellowed by medicine and by a liver that no longer worked the way it should, but the pupils were still black, still sharp, still fixed on Josie with the intensity of a man trying to say the most important thing of his life before time ran out. "Your mother didn't leave," Paul said, his voice hoarse, each word dragging a heavy breath behind it. "Don't ever think that." Josie leaned closer. Her hand gripped her father's, trying to hold him there, trying to hold that moment there, because she knew it was slipping through her fingers like water. "Then where is she, Dad?" The monitor beeped steadily. Footsteps moved in the hallway. Someone was crying in the room next door. A small, exhausted cry, the sound of someone who had been crying for too long. Paul closed his eyes. Not because he was tired, but because that question was heavier than what he could carry in his final breaths. He didn't answer. His hand still held Josie's, but the strength faded, like a rope slipping loose from its knot. Then his hand let go, and he never opened his eyes to speak to Josie again. He died at 3:17 the next morning. Josie sat beside the bed all night, holding the hand that had gone cold, and she didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she was empty. 6 months later, sitting on the trailer floor at 2 o'clock in the morning with her mother's jewelry box on her lap and the note that said, "Forgive me," tucked in her pocket. Josie understood. She understood that her father had known that her mother hadn't left, known that something had happened, something terrible enough for him to keep this box locked away for 20 years, terrible enough for him to never say Catherine's name inside the house, terrible enough for him to carry that secret to his grave, instead of placing it on his only daughter's shoulders. He had stayed silent to protect her, and he had died still silent. But the paper in Josie's pocket was speaking. The box on her lap was speaking. The blind horse outside, standing and wheezing beneath the torn tarp, carrying on its shoulder the same symbol her mother had carved into this box, was speaking too. Everything was speaking at once, and Josie couldn't pretend to be deaf anymore. She closed the box, stood up, walked to the trailer door. Outside, Ghost stood beneath the tarp, head lifted, ears pricked toward the sound of Josie's footsteps. The blind horse couldn't see her, but she was listening, waiting, as if she had known Josie would come out. Josie stood on the steps, looking at the horse, and felt the decision forming in her chest, not in words, but in weight, like a stone dropping to the bottom of a well. Certain, irreversible, she would find out who her mother had been. She would find out where her mother had gone, and she would find out why her father had been forced to carry that secret until his death. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. Ghost turned her ears toward Josie, drew in a long breath, then lowered her head to the water bucket, and Josie stood there in the cold Kentucky night, both hands clenched into fists at her sides, eyes fixed straight into the darkness ahead, and knew she wouldn't turn back. Josie drove her '97 Honda Civic to the auction house as soon as the sky had begun to lighten. The car had been bought from a junkyard for $300. The air conditioner was broken. The passenger side window wouldn't roll all the way up, but it ran, and that was all Josie needed. She parked in front of the auction office, a low metal-roofed building beside the holding pens, the smell of manure and hay still clinging to the air from yesterday's auction. Inside the office, there was only one person, a young woman sitting behind the counter, maybe 20 years old, her hair tied in a loose ponytail, scrolling through her phone with the expression of someone who had been tired of this job before it even began. She didn't look up when Josie walked in. "I bought the horse yesterday," Josie said. "The blind one. I need to know where she came from." The girl kept looking at her phone. "We don't track that. There has to be some kind of record. Brand inspection, intake slip, something. Lady, half the horses that come through here are abandoned or seized. People dump them here. We sell them. That's it." Josie didn't leave. She stood still in front of the counter, both hands resting on the wood, and waited. She didn't say anything else, just stood there and looked. Some people gave up when they were refused the first time. Josie wasn't that kind of person. She had learned how to wait from 20 years of living without answers to anything that mattered. The girl behind the counter finally looked up, maybe because she felt the weight of Josie's stare, or maybe because the silence had stretched on long enough to become more uncomfortable than checking the computer. She sighed, set her phone down, and tapped a few keys on the old keyboard in front of her. Which lot? The last lot. The horse nobody bid on. The girl typed a few more keys, her eyes moving across the screen. Here it is. Mare, no papers. Came in from a farm liquidation lot in Shelby County, Tennessee. Former owner died. Estate liquidated all livestock through an asset management company. The horses were split into lots and sent to auctions across the region. This one was too sick for any auction to take, so she finally got pushed here. What was the former owner's name? Let me see. Harlan Langford. The girl read the name the way someone would read a name from a phone book, with no emphasis, no hesitation, no idea that those two words had just tilted the floor beneath Josie's feet. Josie didn't recognize the name. She had never heard her father mention it, had never seen it in any paperwork inside the trailer. But there was something in those two words that made her know she needed to find out more. She thanked the girl behind the counter, who had already gone back to scrolling on her phone before Josie had even reached the door, and walked out to the parking lot. Josie sat in the car and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, a long line running from the upper left corner down to the lower right. The kind of phone she had bought used for $40 at a pawn shop. She didn't have a data plan, but the small coffee shop, 2 doors down from the auction house, had free Wi-Fi, the password written on the sign hanging outside the door, and Josie had used it enough times to know it by heart. She connected and typed Harlan Langford, Shelby County, Tennessee into the search bar. The results appeared almost immediately, and Josie sat in the broken, air-conditioned Honda Civic in the livestock auction parking lot, staring at the cracked screen, and the world she knew began to tilt in a different direction. Langford wasn't an ordinary family. The Langfords were one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Shelby County, Tennessee. They owned thousands of acres of farmland, livestock ranches, and a network of real estate businesses stretching across the region. They had their own website called Langford Estate, with a polished design, photographs of endless green fields, and a white house with columns across the front porch. There it was. Josie stared at the photograph on the website, then looked down at her own hand, where she could still picture clearly the small photograph inside the jewelry box, the picture of her mother smiling in front of a large house. The same house. And in the top corner of the website, small but sharp, was the Langford Estate logo. Josie didn't need to look long. She had seen that symbol often enough over the past 2 days to recognize it in an instant. She turned off her phone, set it on her lap, and sat still in the car. Not because she needed to think, but because what was forming inside her mind was too large, too heavy, and she needed a minute to find a place to set it down. Her mother might not have been Cat Wynn, the name Josie had used all her life, the name on her birth certificate, the name on the headstone her father had placed in the little cemetery, even though there were no remains beneath it, because there had been nothing to bury. That name might have been false. Her mother might have been someone else, from a wealthy, powerful family in another state, living an entirely different life before somehow ending up in a Kentucky trailer park with a mechanic and a daughter who was now sitting in a car with no working air conditioner, wondering how much of everything she had ever known about her life was actually true. Josie wasn't certain yet. She had only one name from the auction house computer, one old photograph, and the instincts of someone who had lived long enough with lies to recognize when the truth was beginning to show through. But she knew where to look for answers. She started the Honda, waited for it to cough and catch, then drove out of the parking lot. Shelby County, Tennessee, a 5-hour drive southwest. She needed to go back to the trailer, pack a bag, call out from work or accept getting fired, borrow the old pickup truck and horse trailer from the beer-drinking neighbor, and bring Ghost with her, because that horse wasn't luggage. She was evidence. And Josie Wynn, the night shift line cook with $2 in her pocket and a car with broken air conditioning, was about to drive straight into the past her mother had spent 20 years trying to outrun. Josie took 2 days to prepare. On the first day, she went to the diner where she worked the night shift and told the manager she needed a week off. The manager, a middle-aged man with a beer belly named Rick, looked at her over his cheap framed glasses and said that if she wanted time off, she could take it for good, because she had already missed 3 days without permission last month, before her father died, and he had put up with enough. Josie untied her apron, set it on the counter, and walked out without looking back. She didn't have the luxury of mourning a job that paid $7.25 an hour. On the second day, she knocked on the trailer door of her neighbor, Bert, a 70-year-old man who liked to drink beer on the porch in the afternoons, and had an old rusted horse trailer parked behind his place ever since his wife sold their last horse the year before. Bert looked at Josie, looked at the blind horse standing beneath the tarp behind her trailer, then looked back at Josie. "Where are you planning to go with that dying horse?" he asked. "Tennessee," Josie said. Bert took a sip of beer, thought for about 3 seconds, then handed her the trailer keys. "Bring it back in one piece, and fill the tank before you return it." Josie drove out of the trailer park at 4 o'clock in the morning on the third day, while the sky was still dark and fog lay low over the road. Ghost stood in the trailer behind her, quiet, her breathing steadier than it had been a few days earlier because Dr. Greer's antibiotics were beginning to work. Bert's truck pulled the trailer along the highway, rattling and shaking, the engine roaring every time the road climbed uphill, but it ran. 5 hours of driving through Kentucky into Tennessee, past small towns Josie didn't know by name, past yellowing late autumn fields stretching all the way to the horizon, past faded billboards and little churches standing alone beside the road like forgotten sentries. Josie didn't turn on the radio. She drove in silence, with only the sound of the engine and the wind slipping through the window that wouldn't close tight. And she thought about the woman in the photograph, the woman smiling in front of the big house, the woman Josie was beginning to suspect hadn't been Cat Wynn at all, but someone else entirely. Shelby County appeared around noon. The Tennessee countryside looked different from Kentucky, not so different that anyone else might have noticed right away, but different enough for Josie to know she was somewhere else. The hills were gentler, the trees greener even though it was late autumn, and the white wooden fences running along both sides of the road looked as if they belonged in a magazine instead of real life. She found the Langford farm by asking at the first gas station where she stopped to fill up. The man at the gas station gave directions without asking why, as though the Langford property was something everyone in the area knew. Josie drove another 15 minutes along a 2-lane road that curved through the hills, and then she saw it. A tall iron gate stood between 2 red brick pillars, hanging wide open because there was no one left to close it. Beyond the gate was a white gravel road leading up the hill, with grass on both sides grown higher than the knee because no one had cut it. And at the top of the hill, the white house with columns across the front porch stood silent beneath the gray sky. Josie turned off the engine, sat still, looked up at the house through the dirty windshield. She didn't need to take out the photograph from the jewelry box to compare. She recognized the house instantly, the way the white columns stood in a straight line before the porch, the way the gray roof sloped down on both sides, the way the stone steps led up to a front door wide enough for 2 people to walk through side by side. This was the house in the photograph. This was where her mother had stood and smiled more than 20 years ago, before somehow ending up in a Kentucky trailer park under the name Cat Wynn. Josie stepped out of the car. A cold wind blew from the hills, carrying the smell of wet grass and rotting wood. She stood before the open iron gate, looking at the gravel road leading up to the house, and felt something strange surge into her chest. Not sadness, not anger, but the odd feeling of standing on the threshold of a life that might have been hers. Her mother had passed through this gate, had walked this gravel road, had lived in that house, slept in some room on the 2nd floor, eaten breakfast in the big kitchen, run barefoot across the lawn that had now gone wild. Her mother had once been someone else, living another life, in another place. And then all of it had disappeared. Josie didn't go inside. The gate was open, but the main house was locked, sealed with papers from the asset management company, and she hadn't come here to break in. She had come here to understand. She drove to a boarding stable about 10 minutes from the Langford farm, put Ghost in the cleanest stall that $30 a night could buy, then returned to town. She spent the whole afternoon walking through the center of Shelby County, going into stores, coffee shops, the post office, asking anyone willing to listen about the Langford family. No one wanted to talk. The owner of the grocery store shook his head and turned away. The girl making coffee shrugged and said she had only just moved there and didn't know anything. The old man sitting outside the post office looked at Josie for a long time, pressed his lips together, then said, "Why are you asking about that?" and said nothing more, even though Josie stood waiting. The Langford name in this part of the country wasn't the kind of name people brought up in gossip. It was the kind of name people avoided, the way they avoided looking at a crack in their own wall, because they were afraid that if they stared too long, they would see it was larger than they had thought. Josie walked back to where she had parked, as the sky began to darken. She didn't have a hotel, didn't have enough money for a hotel, so she drove to the cheapest motel she could find on her phone. $42 a night, a small room that smelled of old cigarettes and sheets, gone rough from being washed too many times. She lay on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and thought. No one wanted to talk about Langford. That meant there was something that needed to be said, but everyone was afraid. And when people were afraid to talk about a family, that family wasn't just rich, they were dangerous too. But Josie had driven 5 hours with a blind horse and a car with no working air conditioning to get here. She had lost her job. She had spent nearly all the little money she had left. She wasn't going back empty-handed. Tomorrow morning, she would go to the library. The Shelby County Library stood at the end of Main Street, a 2-story red brick building with arched windows and stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Josie arrived at 9 o'clock in the morning, just as the doors opened, and she was the first person to walk in. Inside, it was cool, the smell of old paper and printer's ink blending with the scent of polished wooden floors, that particular smell of places that kept the things people didn't want to remember but couldn't bear to throw away. The librarian was a middle-aged woman with silver hair pinned in a high bun, wearing silver-framed glasses, sitting behind an oak counter, and looking at Josie through the lenses with just enough politeness not to be called cold. Josie asked about the old newspaper archive and public records section. The librarian pointed her toward a back room, where 3 old computers were connected to the network, and a microfiche reader sat in the corner beneath a thin layer of dust, clearly used by very few people. Josie sat down in front of the computer and began searching. She typed Catherine Langford, into the local newspaper database search bar. Not many results appeared, but they were enough to make her hands stop over the keyboard. The first article was from the Shelby County Register, published in August of 2004. The headline was brief, placed on page 5, not the front page, as if the case hadn't been important enough, or as if someone had made sure it wouldn't be important enough. Catherine Langford, 29, youngest daughter of Harlan Langford, was reported missing on July 12th. The Shelby County Sheriff's Department conducted an investigation and concluded that Catherine Langford left voluntarily, no sign of foul play. Case closed. Josie read it twice. Left voluntarily. 2 neat, clean words that packaged 20 years of her pain into a conclusion she knew for certain was a lie. People didn't write "forgive me" on a note hidden at the bottom of a jewelry box when they left voluntarily. People didn't change their names, change their identities, and change their entire lives when they left voluntarily. She moved to the microfiche reader, loaded the roll of film containing newspaper issues from 2004 to 2006, and began scrolling. Her eyes swept over page after page, headline after headline, small item after small item tucked away in the corners, searching for anything connected to Langford. And she found it. March of 2005, nearly 1 year after Catherine disappeared. The Langford family sells 3,000 acres of farmland and livestock property to Mercer Holdings in a multi-million-dollar deal. Josie read the article carefully. The deal was described as a strategic partnership, but even with her limited knowledge of real estate, Josie recognized that something was wrong. The sale price was nearly 40% below market value. No one sold family land for 40% below value unless they were desperate or being forced. Harlan Langford wasn't desperate. He was one of the wealthiest men in the county, so he had been forced. Josie kept scrolling. She found 2 more small articles about Mercer Holdings, a real estate and investment corporation based in Memphis, owning land, commercial properties, and diverse business interests. The article didn't specify. Chairman, Henrik Mercer. She wrote the name on the back of a gas station receipt stuffed in her pocket. Then she went back to the computer and searched for one more thing. The name of the detective assigned to Catherine's disappearance. The county police records weren't public online, but the original article included a quote. Detective Wade Pilson, who handled the case, said there was no evidence that Catherine Langford was in danger. Wade Pilson. Josie typed the name into the search bar. And this was where the thread began to knot. Wade Pilson left the Shelby County Sheriff's Department in 2006, 2 years after signing off on the conclusion that closed Catherine's case. Reason for departure. Transition to the private sector. Josie found the name Wade Pilson again in the public business records of the state of Tennessee, listed among the senior personnel of a company called Mercer Holdings. Title: Head of Security. Josie sat still in front of the computer. The blue glow of the screen lit her face in the dim room. The librarian passed behind her, footsteps soft on the wooden floor, saying nothing. And inside Josie's mind, the scattered pieces began fitting themselves together into a shape. Her mother disappeared in 2004. The detective in charge concluded that her mother had left voluntarily and closed the case. 1 year later, the Langford family sold land to Mercer Holdings at an unusually low price. 2 years later, that same detective became head of security for Mercer Holdings. A missing mother. Land sold cheap. A detective bought off. 3 events, spaced a few years apart, seeming unrelated if each was viewed alone. But placed side by side, they formed a straight line, and that line led back to the same name, Mercer. Josie didn't know what Mercer Holdings was beyond what the articles said, didn't know who Henrik Mercer was, didn't know how deep his relationship with the Langford family went. But she knew one thing. Her mother had vanished, and the name Mercer stuck to everything around that disappearance like grease on a mechanic's hands. Impossible to wash clean no matter how long you scrubbed. She turned off the computer, stood up, thanked the librarian with a nod, and stepped out into the sunlight. She needed to find someone willing to talk about the Langford family, and she knew exactly where to start. In the list of family members mentioned in the article, beside Harlan Langford and Catherine Langford, there was one more name, Corbin Langford, Catherine's older brother. And according to the public residency records Josie had found before shutting down the computer, he was still living in Tennessee, in a mountain cabin 40 minutes outside town. The road up to Corbin Langford's cabin wasn't on the phone map. Josie had to rely on the address written in the residency record and the instincts of someone used to driving nameless roads in rural Kentucky. She turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt lane running through an oak forest, climbed uphill, rounded 2 blind curves, and kept going until the trees began to thin, and a small wooden cabin appeared on a ridge, standing alone in the clearing like someone who had deliberately separated himself from the rest of the world. The cabin was old but solid, with a dark metal roof, a narrow wooden porch, a rocking chair, and a small table holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Josie turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, looking through the windshield. She hadn't called first, hadn't sent a letter, hadn't warned him in any way, because in the 2 days she had spent in Shelby County, she had learned that when the Langford name was mentioned, if people had time to prepare, they used that time to close doors. She stepped out of the car, crossed the dirt yard, climbed the 3 wooden steps, and knocked. Silence. Then came the heavy sound of footsteps inside, the scrape of a bolt being pulled back, and the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was about 62 years old, tall and thin, his hair almost entirely silver but still thick, his face long and deeply lined, his dark brown eyes set beneath heavy brows. He wore an old flannel shirt and faded khaki pants, standing slightly bent, like a man who had carried something heavy on his back for too long. He looked at Josie, and everything in his face changed, not slowly, immediately, as if someone had switched off a light. The blood drained from his face. His skin went from pale pink to ashen white in a single breath. His hand clutched the edge of the door, the knuckles going white, and he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper, "God, you look exactly like your mother." Josie said nothing for a few seconds. She only stood there on the wooden steps, looking at a man she had never met, a man who had just called her "you" with the tenderness of family, and spoken of her mother as if he knew exactly who she was. "You're Corbin Langford," Josie said. It wasn't a question. "And you knew my mother." Corbin didn't answer right away. He stood looking at her for a few more seconds, and Josie saw in his eyes the same thing she had seen in her father's eyes for 20 years, the same grief, the same secret, the same weight pressing on the chest that no one was willing to put down. Then he stepped back, opened the door wider, and said, "Come in." Inside, the cabin was small, neat, sparsely furnished, but clean. Corbin poured coffee for Josie without asking whether she wanted any, set the cup in front of her on the small wooden table in the living room, then sat in the chair across from her. His 2 hands rested on his knees, and Josie realized he was trying to keep them from shaking. "How did you find me?" he asked. "Public residency records, and an old article at the library." Corbin nodded slowly, as if he had known this day would come, and had still hoped it wouldn't. "What do you know so far?" Josie told him, briefly, without emotion, only the facts. The horse carrying the Langford symbol, the jewelry box her mother had left behind, the note inside, Harlan Langford's name on the liquidation records, the article about Catherine's disappearance, the land sale to Mercer Holdings, Detective Wade Pilson. She placed each piece on the table like laying down cards, and waited. When Corbin finished listening, he closed his eyes and let out a long breath. When he opened them again, he looked 10 years older than he had when he opened the door. "My father, Harlan, wasn't just a ranch owner," he began, his voice low, each word heavy as if he were lifting stones. "He was Henrik Mercer's business partner. Langford land was used as a front. Mercer moved money through land deals, clean on paper, not clean underneath. I knew, but I didn't ask, because back then our family lived comfortably, and no one wanted to look at the price of that comfort." He stopped, took a sip of coffee, his hand trembling slightly as he set the cup down. "Your mother found out when she was 28. Catherine was smart, always smarter than everyone else in the house. She found the real ledgers in my father's office, compared them with the public books, and understood. She wanted to take them to the FBI. Josie listened without interrupting, without moving. The coffee in front of her grew cold, untouched. "Then one night, someone came to the house," Corbin went on, his voice dropping lower, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I heard arguing downstairs, my father's voice and another man's. I didn't see the man's face clearly. I only heard his voice, deep, cold, the kind of voice that was used to giving orders. The next morning, Catherine was gone. Gone." Corbin used that one word in place of everything he didn't know or didn't dare say. Josie asked, "And where was I then?" Corbin looked at her, and for the first time in the conversation, his eyes filled with tears. "You were at school." Paul picked you up that afternoon and said your mother had to go on a business trip. You didn't cry. You just sat by the door waiting for a full week. The sentence hung in the air between them. Josie swallowed, her throat tight, but kept her face calm. She hadn't come here to cry. She had come here to know. "What did Harlan say?" she asked. He said Catherine had left on her own. Said she was tired of the family, tired of the life, wanted to start over. And everyone believed it, or pretended to, because believing was easier than asking questions. But you didn't believe it. I didn't, but I had no proof, and I was afraid. Corbin said the word afraid without shame, without excuse. Just the truth, bare and heavy. I was afraid because I knew people connected to Henrik Mercer, who asked the wrong questions, disappeared just like Catherine. So I stayed quiet. Quiet for 20 years. Josie placed both hands on the table and looked straight into Corbin's eyes. "My mother didn't leave," she said, her voice firm, not shaking. "My mother ran. She changed her name, married an ordinary man, lived hidden in Kentucky for 7 years, and then someone still found her." Corbin looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly, heavily. "If you go looking for that answer," he said, his voice hoarse, "you'll have to face the people I haven't dared to name for 20 years. "I've faced more than you think," Josie said. Corbin looked at her, looked into the gray-blue eyes so exactly like Catherine's, looked at the way she sat with her back straight and didn't blink, and he understood that this girl wasn't going back to Kentucky, not because she was brave, but because she had come too close to the truth to accept living with the question again. Josie drove down the mountain from Corbin's cabin as the day was leaning toward evening. Murky golden light slipping through the oak canopy and scattering in patches across the dirt road. Her head felt heavy with everything Corbin had just told her. New fragments fitting beside the old ones until they formed a picture she wished she couldn't see so clearly. Her mother had discovered the false ledgers. Her mother had wanted to do the right thing, and her mother had disappeared because of it. Josie turned onto the main road, merging into the sparse late-afternoon traffic of rural Tennessee, and 10 minutes later, she looked into the rearview mirror for the first time since leaving the cabin. The black SUV was there, about 5 cars behind her, its windows so dark she couldn't see anyone inside. Josie didn't panic. She had lived long enough in places where noticing things wasn't a skill, but a condition for survival. She knew how to tell the difference between a car that happened to be going the same way and a car that was following. This SUV was following. It kept an even distance, never closer, never farther. When Josie sped up, it sped up. When she slowed down, it slowed down. Like an invisible rope tied the two vehicles together, and Josie was on the end that had no right to cut it. She drove another 15 minutes, her heart beating fast, but her hands steady on the wheel, then turned into the gas station at the 3-way junction before town. She parked, shut off the engine, and sat still, watching the rearview mirror. The SUV slowed as it reached the junction, but it didn't turn into the station. It went straight, drifting past like a black shadow sliding over water, and disappeared around the bend ahead. Josie exhaled. She got out of the car. Her legs were trembling a little, but she forced herself to walk straight, pushed through the glass door, and went into the convenience store inside the gas station. She bought a bottle of water, an energy bar, and a pocket knife, the small kind with a folding blade, $4.95, sitting on the rack beside lighters and chewing gum. She didn't know what this little knife could do if the people in the black SUV decided not to just follow anymore, but carrying it in her pocket made her feel as if she wasn't completely empty-handed. She went back outside, opened the car door, and stopped. On the windshield, tucked beneath the wiper on the driver's side, was a business card. Josie looked around the parking lot. The gas station was nearly empty. There was only one truck parked at the far end, the driver asleep inside the cab. No black SUV. No one. But the business card lay there, neat and precise, like a message from someone who had entered her house without her ever knowing. Josie picked it up. Thick, cream-colored paper, raised lettering, only 2 lines. The first line, Mercer Holdings. The second line, a phone number. No name, no title, no address, no message. But the meaning was clearer than any words they could have written. "We know you're here. We know what you're looking for, and we're close enough to put this on your windshield without you ever noticing." Josie shoved the business card into her pants pocket, got into the car, started the engine, and drove straight back to the motel. She didn't look in the rearview mirror, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she knew that if she looked back now, fear would win, and she would turn the car toward Kentucky before she had time to think. She drove back to the motel, locked the room door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the bed with her back against the wall and the pocket knife she had just bought already open on her lap. She sat like that until the sky went fully dark, the light outside fading through the gap in the curtains, and the motel room sinking into darkness, with only the small red glow of the alarm clock on the nightstand blinking second after second. Then, her phone vibrated. Josie looked at the screen. Unknown number. No name. No area code she recognized. She sat there watching the phone vibrate on the bed, vibrating through the third ring, the fourth, the fifth. Then she picked it up and held it to her ear without saying anything. Silence on the other end. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then the voice came. A man's voice. Old, gentle, slow. Each word placed down carefully, like someone arranging chess pieces on a board. The kind of voice that didn't need to get loud to send a chill down someone's spine. You look like your mother. Same stubbornness, too. But stubbornness didn't save your mother, did it? Josie gripped the phone tightly. Her knuckles went white. Who are you? She asked, her voice calmer than what she felt inside. Someone who knows what happened to Catherine Langford. Then the call ended. Neat. Clean. No lingering. No waiting for her reaction. No chance for her to ask another question. It left only the steady beeping in her ear, and silence flooding the motel room like water pouring into a broken boat. Josie lowered the phone, set it on the bed, watched the screen dim, then go completely dark. And for the first time since she had walked into the auction and raised that $2 bill to buy the blind horse, Josie was afraid. Not the kind of fear she had known before. Fear of not having enough money to pay hospital bills. Fear of losing her job. Fear of a cold night in the trailer when the heater broke. This was a different kind of fear. Fear that she would disappear, like her mother. Standing there one day, gone the next, and no one knowing why, and no one asking long enough to find out. She would become a small article on page 5 of the local paper, 4 lines, concluded as having left voluntarily, then forgotten. Josie sat on the motel bed, her back against the wall, the pocket knife on her lap, and stared into the darkness. Outside, the sound of cars passing on the road grew thinner. Crickets chirped. The wind struck the window curtains, and the Mercer Holdings business card lay in her pants pocket, heavier than paper, heavier even than the knife on her lap. Heavy because it was proof that she had gone too far to turn back unnoticed. 2 days passed after that phone call, and Josie didn't leave. She knew she should leave. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive for 27 years, screamed at her to return Bert's trailer, load Ghost behind the car, drive 5 hours back to Kentucky, go back to the trailer park, find a new job, and forget everything she had learned over the past week. But the other part, the deeper part, the part she had inherited from the woman who had written, "Forgive me," on a tiny folded note tucked at the bottom of a jewelry box. That part refused to turn back, so Josie stayed. She spent those 2 days at the boarding stable with Ghost, giving her medicine on schedule, feeding her small amounts often, just as Dr. Greer had instructed, brushing her coat with a brush borrowed from the stable owner, and talking to her about things that didn't matter, only to fill the silence. Ghost listened. Her ears were always turned toward Josie's voice, and every now and then she gave a small toss of her head as if agreeing with something Josie said, though Josie knew she was only chasing flies. On the morning of the 3rd day, Josie was standing inside Ghost's stall, a brush in her hand, stroking it along the horse's back, when she heard the sound of an engine. Not an ordinary engine, not the sound of a hay truck or the stable owner's pickup. It was smooth, low, steady, the kind of sound only expensive cars made, like a large cat purring deep in its throat. Josie stepped out of the stall and looked toward the parking lot. A black Bentley was parked right in the middle of the lot, shining beneath the morning sun, looking as out of place among the horse stalls and piles of hay as a diamond dropped into a trash bin. 3 people stepped out. The first 2 were middle-aged men dressed in black, built so similarly they might have been cast from the same mold. They stood on either side of the car, arms either crossed over their chests or relaxed at their sides, their eyes sweeping the parking lot, sweeping the stable, sweeping Josie, then sweeping back again from the beginning. Bodyguards. Josie recognized that at once. She had seen men like them before, not in Shelby County but in Louisville, standing outside the doors of nightclubs near the diner where she carried plates and sometimes looked across the street. Men who weren't there to talk, but to make sure no one said the wrong thing. The third person stepped out of the back seat, and Josie understood immediately that this wasn't one of the hired hands. This was the man who owned the hired hands. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, no tie. The top button of his white shirt open, revealing sharp collarbones. His hair was black, cut short and neat, not in a fashionable way, but in the way of a man who had no time to think about hair and still looked perfect, because everything about him was controlled down to the smallest detail. His eyes were a deep blue. Not ocean blue, but blue like steel, like deep water where light didn't touch the bottom. His face was handsome, but not the kind of handsome that made people want to come closer. It was the kind that made people take one step back without understanding why, like seeing a black panther lying still behind glass, and knowing the glass could break at any moment. He walked from the car to the stable in steady steps, neither fast nor slow, with absolute confidence, as if every square foot of ground beneath him belonged to him, and perhaps it did. Behind him, another man followed, 36 years old, shorter but broader, his face expressionless, his right hand resting loosely in his coat pocket in a way Josie knew wasn't because he was cold. This man's eyes never stopped moving, sweeping from left to right, from far to near, constantly, like a living security camera made of bone and flesh. The man in the suit stopped 5 steps from Josie, looked at her, then looked at Ghost, standing in the stall behind her, head raised, ears pricked toward the unfamiliar footsteps. Then he looked back at Josie, and spoke, his voice deep, flat, emotionless, every word falling between them like stones dropped onto still water. "You bought that horse in Kentucky. $2. Not a question, a statement. Like the business card on the windshield, like the midnight phone call. This man knew everything. Josie didn't step back. She stood still, the horse brush still in her right hand, and looked straight into those steel blue eyes. "Who are you?" she asked. "The man who owns the farm where that horse was born," he said. "So you're Mercer." He neither confirmed nor denied it. He only tilted his head slightly to one side, 1 centimeter, as if Josie had said something that made him reassess her. "You know more than I expected," he said. "I don't know much," Josie said. "I only know my mother's name was Catherine Langford, and she disappeared 20 years ago, and the name Mercer sticks to everything around that disappearance. I want to know why." He looked at her, for a long time, not with assessment, not with threat, but as if he were reading her, as if he were turning the pages of the book standing in front of him and deciding whether the book was worth reading further or should be closed. "You should stop here," he said, his voice unchanged. "Go back to Kentucky. Forget the horse. Forget the name Langford. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. There are people in my world who won't be as polite as I am." Josie tightened her grip on the brush handle. "I got the business card. I got the midnight phone call. If that's polite, I don't want to know what rude looks like." For the first time, something shifted on his face. Not a smile, not surprise, just a flicker at the corner of his eyes, so quick Josie wasn't sure whether she had imagined it. Maybe recognition, maybe interest, the look of a man used to everyone stepping back when he stepped forward, now meeting someone who didn't step back for the first time. He said nothing more. He turned away and walked back toward the car, his steps as steady as they had been when he arrived. The 2 bodyguards immediately changed positions, one opening the car door, the other standing watch until he had settled into the back seat. The man whose eyes never stopped sweeping, the one who had followed Knox Mercer throughout the entire encounter, was the last to get in. But before he stepped inside, he stopped, looked at Josie, and said quietly, his voice even, not threatening, yet heavier than any threat could have been, "My boss rarely goes to meet anyone himself. You should take that as a serious sign, in both meanings." Then he got into the car, closed the door, and the Bentley backed out of the parking lot, gliding smoothly over the gravel before disappearing behind the trees at the end of the road. Josie stood there, still holding the brush, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her temples. Ghost stepped up behind her, her muzzle touching Josie's shoulder, her warm breath passing through the thin fabric of Josie's shirt. And Josie stood in the middle of a boarding stable that cost $30 a night, the smell of hay and horse manure in the air, thinking about the man who had just stood 5 steps away from her, the man as beautiful as a blade, and dangerous in a way she had never encountered in 27 years of living in a Kentucky trailer park, Knox Mercer. She had found the name Corbin didn't dare speak, and that name had just come looking for her. The rain began falling at 9 o'clock at night. Not heavy rain, only that steady, light autumn rain in Tennessee, the kind that slipped through window cracks and dampened everything in a motel room that was already damp to begin with. Josie lay on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling mottled with old water stains, the pocket knife on the nightstand beside the pepper spray she had bought at the convenience store right after Knox Mercer left that afternoon. She couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to stop running. It kept replaying everything that had happened over the past week, from the auction to the jewelry box, to Corbin to the business card, to the midnight call to the man with steel blue eyes standing 5 steps from her in the stable that afternoon, trying to arrange it all into something that made sense and failing. The knock came at 11:20. Josie sat up sharply. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed the pepper spray, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. Knox Mercer stood outside, alone. No bodyguards, no polished Bentley, only a black car parked a few yards away. Lights off, engine off. He wore a black leather jacket instead of a suit, the collar raised, his rain-wet hair clinging to his forehead, and he looked entirely different from a few hours earlier, not because of the clothes, but because something on his face had changed, as if he had stripped away some layer between then and now, and what lay underneath wasn't what Josie had imagined. She opened the door, the pepper spray raised level with her chest, her thumb resting on the button. Knox looked at the spray, then looked at her. "I told you to go back to Kentucky," he said. "And I told you I'm not good at listening," Josie said. They stood looking at each other through the motel doorway, rain falling behind Knox, the dull yellow hallway light washing over half his face. And Josie saw what she hadn't seen that afternoon at the stable. Exhaustion. Not the kind that came from lack of sleep, the kind that gathered over years, the kind that belonged to someone carrying something too heavy for too long without being able to set it down. And it was written into his eyes, into the curve of his shoulders when there were no bodyguards around to straighten his back for, into the way he stood on the threshold of a cheap motel room at 11 o'clock at night, in the rain, like a man who didn't know where he was supposed to be. "Come in," Josie said. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because the pepper spray gave her enough courage. Maybe because she needed answers more than she needed safety. Or maybe because she had seen that exhaustion and recognized it. Because she had carried something just like it on her own shoulders for the past 6 months. Knox stepped inside. The motel room was so small that he filled it by presence alone. He looked around, at the single bed with wrinkled sheets, the small table marked with cigarette burns, the one white plastic chair, the thin curtains casting streetlight into the room, and Josie wondered whether this was the first time in Knox Mercer's life that he had ever stepped into a $42 a night room. He sat down on the plastic chair. Josie sat on the bed across from him, the pepper spray still in her hand but lowered to her lap. The space between them was less than 6 feet, but it felt like a ravine. "Why are you here?" Josie asked. "Because you refuse to leave." That isn't why someone drives to a motel at 11 o'clock at night alone without bodyguards. Knox looked at her. It was a different look from that afternoon. That afternoon, he had read her. Now he was weighing how much to say. Then he spoke. Not everything, but enough. "My father, Henrik Mercer, died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast. He was gone within 4 months of the diagnosis. I inherited everything. Mercer Holdings, real estate, personnel, and the things that don't exist on paper." He stopped, looking down at his hands resting on his knees. Large hands, clean, not calloused, like Josie's father's hands, but not the hands of a man who had never carried anything heavy either. "I'm trying to change the system from the inside," Knox went on, his voice lower, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Josie. "Bring everything back to legal ground. Cut off the channels that can't be defended anymore. It's taken 3 years, and I'm only halfway through." "But?" Josie asked, because she could hear the word hanging at the end of the sentence even though he hadn't said it. But Sterling Voss. The name fell between them like a stone dropped into a deep well. Josie remembered the voice on the phone at midnight. Old, gentle, slow. "Voss was my father's advisor for 30 years, Knox said. "He controls part of the organization I haven't been able to touch yet. He doesn't want change. He wants everything to stay the same. because the way things are is where his power lives. And my mother? Josie asked. Knox was silent for a beat, then another. The organization's internal records say Catherine Langford left on her own. That was the version Voss reported to my father. I had no reason to question it until you appeared at the auction and bought the horse carrying the Langford symbol, then started asking questions no one had asked for 20 years. If you knew something was wrong, Josie said, her voice firm, not shaking, why didn't you do anything? Knox looked at her, and in the dull yellow light of that cheap motel room, Josie saw something she hadn't expected to see in this man. Not coldness, not control, but the conflict of someone standing between two things that both mattered, knowing that choosing one would destroy the other. Because when I inherited it, Knox said slowly, each word heavy, I inherited 200 people who depend on this system. Their families, their children, people who don't know anything about the dirty parts, only that every month they get paid, their children go to school, and the roof over their heads doesn't leak. I can't tear it down in one night without someone paying the price. The motel room went quiet. Rain fell outside, steady and light. Water moved through old pipes behind the wall. Two people breathed in a room too small for any conversation carrying this much weight. My mother already paid the price, Josie said. Not loudly, not accusingly, just the truth, placed between them as gently as setting a coffee cup on a table, yet heavier than anything else in the room. Knox didn't look away, didn't defend himself, didn't explain further. He looked straight into Josie's eyes and said 2 words. I know. 2 words. Not enough for forgiveness. Not enough to change anything that had happened, but enough for Josie to understand that the man sitting in front of her on a white plastic chair in a $42 motel room, his hair still wet from the rain, his leather jacket still holding water on the shoulders, wasn't the monster she had imagined. He was something more complicated than a monster. He was a man who knew he was carrying a monster's legacy, and he was trying to find a way to set it down without crushing the people standing around it. Josie didn't trust Knox Mercer. She wasn't that foolish, but she believed the exhaustion on his face, because that was something that couldn't be faked. They sat in the motel room for nearly another hour after that. The rain kept falling outside, steady, patient, and inside that $42 a night room, 2 people who hadn't even known the other existed a week ago were sketching the edges of an agreement both of them knew neither side fully trusted. Josie didn't trust Knox. She didn't trust anyone with the Mercer name, didn't trust anyone who drove a Bentley, and especially didn't trust anyone who showed up at the door of a motel room at 11 o'clock at night in the rain and said he wanted to help. She had lived long enough at the bottom to know that when rich people said, I want to help, the next sentence was always, and this is what I need from you. But Josie knew something else too. She needed information, and Knox Mercer was the only person in the world with access to Henrik Mercer's private files. Files that, according to what Knox had just told her, were kept in a safe inside the family mansion, a place Josie couldn't step into even if she suddenly grew 10 pairs of wings. She needed him. And he, in a way Josie had begun to see over the past hour, needed her too. Knox didn't say it plainly. He wasn't the kind of man who said things plainly, but Josie could read between the lines, could read it in the way he chose his words, in the silences between sentences, in the way he looked at her when he mentioned Voss. Knox needed proof that Voss had gone beyond Henrik's orders in Catherine's case. Henrik had ordered Catherine taken away, not anything more than that. If Knox could prove that Voss had acted on his own, had overstepped, had deceived even the head of the organization, then Knox would have a legitimate reason, both inside the system and outside it, to remove Voss. And Josie was living proof that Catherine hadn't left on her own, the way Voss had reported. Catherine had had a family, had had a husband, had had a child, had lived hidden under a false name for 7 years. No one simply left on their own, then changed their name, married, had a child, and wrote an apology letter to that child before hiding it at the bottom of a jewelry box. Catherine had run, and Josie's existence was proof that Voss had lied. I'll show you my father's files, Knox said, his voice low, placing each word down carefully, like a man walking across thin ice. The safe is in the mansion. Everything related to Langford is there. If there's proof of what Voss did, it'll be in there. In exchange? Josie asked, because she knew there was always an exchange. Knox looked at her. In exchange, you follow my instructions. You don't act alone. You don't run around asking more people questions. You don't knock on anyone's door without telling me first. You've stirred up enough already, and Voss knows you're here. From now on, every step you take without me knowing is a step you might not come back from. Are you protecting me or controlling me? Both, Knox said, without hesitation. And you should be grateful I'm doing both instead of only one. Josie looked at him. The man sitting on the white plastic chair in the motel room, his hair still damp, the dull yellow light shadowing half his face, didn't look like the mafia boss she had imagined when she first heard the Mercer name. He looked like a man playing a chess game where every piece was an actual human being, and every move cost someone blood, and he was trying to find a move where no one had to pay. Josie didn't know whether that was possible, but she knew that now, in this moment, sitting in this motel room, this was the best chance she had, and maybe the only one. Fine, she said. I agree. Knox nodded. No handshake. No signed paper. In his world, a spoken word was either enough or it wasn't, and he would know which when the time came. He stood, straightened his leather jacket, and walked toward the door. Josie stood too, following behind him, and watched him pause at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, turning back to look at her. That horse, he said, and his voice shifted subtly, half a tone lighter, as if this question stood outside the game, somewhere more private, where he wasn't used to stepping. What are you feeding her? Josie was so surprised she forgot to answer for 2 seconds. Of all the questions she had imagined Knox Mercer might ask before walking out the door, a question about the blind horse's food hadn't been on the list. Leftovers from the stable, she said. The owner lets me take a few handfuls of second-grade hay. The other horses don't finish. Knox said nothing. He gave a short, quiet nod, then stepped out into the rain and walked toward the car. Josie closed the door, locked it, leaned her back against the thin wooden panel, and stood there in the dark until the sound of the engine disappeared down the road. She had just agreed to work with a mafia boss to find the truth about her mother. In her head, the rational part of her screamed that she was insane, but the other part, the deeper part, the part that had kept her standing through 20 years without a mother and 6 months without a father, only said, "This is the only way." And she knew, even though she had just promised to follow Knox's instructions, that when the time came to break that promise, she would break it without blinking, because a promise to a stranger weighed less than a promise to her mother. And the only promise Josie was holding in her heart now was the one she had whispered into the darkness inside the trailer on the night she read Catherine's handwritten note. I'll find out what happened to you. The next morning, when Josie arrived at the stable, a small truck was parked in front of the gate. The driver unloaded 10 bales of high-quality hay, the kind Josie always had to scroll past whenever she checked prices online, because it cost half a week of motel rent, along with a cardboard box filled with antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, supplemental vitamins, and hoof oil. No card, no message, no sender's name. Josie stood watching the driver set down the final bale and drive away. Then she turned toward Ghost. The blind horse had already stuck her head out of the stall, her nose pulling hard at the air, catching the smell of fresh hay, and her whole thin body began to tremble, not from fear, but from excitement, the first time Josie had seen her excited since the day she bought her. Josie opened one bale of hay, spread it into the feed trough, and Ghost buried her muzzle in it immediately, chewing slowly, her cloudy eyes closing, her head lowered, as if this was the first meal of her life that was truly worth chewing. Josie leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, watching the horse eat, and shook her head. Don't get used to it, she said softly. He isn't a good man. Ghost didn't care. She pushed deeper into the hay, and Josie stood there watching her eat until the sun had climbed high and light poured into the stable, and she had to admit to herself that for the first time in a very long while, Ghost looked like a horse that was living instead of a horse waiting to die. Knox picked Josie up the following afternoon, not in the Bentley, but in the black SUV with tinted windows, the same kind of vehicle Josie had seen following her on the road from Corbin's cabin. Fletcher sat in the passenger seat, his face expressionless, his eyes looking straight ahead, though Josie knew he was registering everything around him without needing to turn his head. They drove 20 minutes out of town, past country roads, then turned onto a private drive where an iron gate opened by remote as the vehicle approached. A stone wall taller than a man ran along both sides, cameras mounted at even intervals along the top, and when the SUV passed through the gate, Josie saw two men standing at the small guard station on the right, both of them watching the car pass without nodding, without waving, without any expression at all. The stone-paved road led up the hill, bordered on both sides by neatly trimmed lawns, and rows of maple trees turning red and orange in the afternoon sun. The mansion appeared at the top of the hill, and Josie knew at once that it belonged to an entirely different class from the Langford house. The Langford house was large in the style of a southern estate, beautiful but still somehow close to the land. The Mercer mansion was large in the style of power. Gray stone, tall glass windows, a flat modern roof, looking more like a fortress than a home, the kind of architecture that didn't say, "Welcome," but said, "You don't belong here." Knox parked in front of the main entrance, shut off the engine, and looked at Josie through the rearview mirror. "Follow me. Don't turn anywhere. Don't open any door I don't open first." Josie nodded. They stepped into the house. The foyer was wide, the ceiling high, the floor marble, and it held the particular silence of houses too large for the number of people living inside them. Fletcher walked behind Josie, 3 steps away, close enough to react if she did anything unexpected. Josie felt his eyes on the back of her neck the way she felt sunlight, warm and unceasing. Knox led her down a staircase at the end of the east hallway, through a steel door that required a code to open, and into the basement. Not the damp, dark kind of basement from movies, but a wide room with bright white lights, concrete walls, tables, chairs, and at the far end, a safe half as tall as a person, built into the wall, the kind of safe Josie had only ever seen on television. Knox stood before it, entered the code, turned the key, and the heavy steel door opened with a low click. Inside were files, dozens of folders arranged neatly, numbered, labeled in handwriting, financial records, contracts, lists of names. And in the lower corner, 2 passports Josie knew were fake from even a quick glance, because they held the photograph of the same man under 2 different names. Knox didn't let Josie search through everything. He pulled out a large envelope sealed with brown tape, the front marked in firm, right-slanting handwriting with a ballpoint pen. Langford, 2004. He placed the envelope on the table in front of Josie. "This is everything my father kept about this matter," Knox said. "I'd never opened it before. I opened it for the first time the night after you showed up at the stable." Josie looked at the envelope. It had been opened, the brown tape cleanly cut, which meant Knox was telling the truth. He had opened it recently. She pulled the envelope toward her, opened it wider, and emptied the contents onto the table. 4 documents. Josie read them one by one, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes missing nothing. The first page was an internal investigation report, typed, with no agency heading, no logo, clearly a document of the organization and not the law. Its contents said that Catherine Langford, daughter of Harlan Langford, had accessed the real ledgers in Harlan's office and copied part of their contents. There were signs that Catherine was preparing to pass the documents to a third party, possibly a federal agency. Sterling Voss had discovered this through an internal source and reported directly to Henrik Mercer. The second page was a handwritten note. Josie recognized that the handwriting was different from the writing on the envelope, neater, firmer, the hand of someone more used to giving orders with a pen than with his mouth. Henrik's handwriting. The contents were brief, written in bullet points. "Remove her from the region. Cut off all contact with family. Make sure she can't reach any agency. No harm. Repeat, no harm." Josie read the final line twice. No harm. Henrik Mercer, the crime lord, the head of the underground empire, had written that line and underlined it. That didn't make him a good man. But it told Josie that what had happened to her mother hadn't been part of his plan. The third page was a smaller piece of paper, handwritten, the script entirely different from the first 2. Thin strokes, leaning left, small and tight, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly and didn't want anyone else to read it easily. There were only 2 lines. Resolved. Threat no longer exists. Josie stared at those 2 lines. 6 words. And inside those 6 words were 20 years without a mother, her father dying with a secret on his lips, a 7-year-old child sitting by the door for a week, the folded "forgive me" note hidden at the bottom of a jewelry box. All of it fit neatly into 6 handwritten words from the man Josie now knew by name, Sterling Voss. "My father ordered your mother taken out of the region," Knox said, his voice low, standing behind Josie. "He didn't order anything beyond that. His note is clear. But Voss chose to go beyond that order on his own. and he reported it back in 6 words, as if he had just finished clearing a dinner table. Josie didn't turn to look at Knox. She was looking at the 4th page, a receipt from a private transport company, dated the same day Catherine was reported missing, listing the destination address as Pikeville, Tennessee. Pikeville. Josie knew Pikeville. It sat in eastern Tennessee, about 5 hours from where she was staying. And inside Josie's mind, the final piece fell into place with a soft click she could almost hear in her ears. Catherine had prepared to run before Voss found her. She had made false papers under the name Cat Wynne. She had copied the ledgers. And if Catherine was as smart as Corbin had said, as the note inside the jewelry box proved, then she wouldn't have taken everything with her when she ran. She would have hidden a copy, buried it somewhere along the way, in a place where she could return for it once she was safe. Pikeville was on the route from Tennessee to Kentucky. Catherine had stopped there, had hidden the evidence there, then kept running, and Voss had intercepted her before she ever reached Kentucky. The evidence was still in Pikeville. Voss didn't know it existed. For 20 years, it had been lying there, waiting for someone to come looking. Josie folded the receipt, slipped it into her shirt pocket beside her mother's handwritten note, and turned to look at Knox. "I need to go to Pikeville," she said. They hadn't even made it all the way up the stairs from the basement when Fletcher blocked the top of the hallway. He wasn't running, wasn't frantic, but something on his face had changed, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes swept faster than usual, and Josie knew before he opened his mouth that the news wasn't good. "Someone tipped off Voss," Fletcher said, his voice low, his eyes on Knox, not Josie. "He knows the girl is here." Knox didn't react with his face, no frown, no clenched teeth, no change in his breathing. But Josie was standing close enough to see his right hand curl into a fist and then release within 1 second, so quickly that if she had blinked at the wrong moment, she would have missed it. "Take her out the back," Knox told Fletcher, his voice unchanged, though every word had grown sharper, cleaner. The voice of a man counting each second. "Get her somewhere safe. I'll handle things inside." Then Knox looked at Josie. Fast. 1 second. But in that 1 second, Josie saw what he didn't say out loud. "Go now. Don't look back. I'm not sure what's going to happen in the next few hours." Fletcher led Josie through the kitchen hallway, out the rear door, and toward the west parking area of the mansion, where the black SUV sat parked alone. He opened the door for Josie, and Josie climbed in, but before Fletcher could start the engine, she said, "I need to get Ghost." Fletcher looked at her through the rearview mirror. "The horse can wait." "I'm not going anywhere without her," Josie said, her voice calm but absolute. The same voice she had used with Dr. Greer when the woman told her Ghost should be put down, the kind of voice that left no room for negotiation. Fletcher was silent for 3 seconds, then gave a short nod and drove toward the boarding stable. The road took 10 minutes. Josie sat in the back seat, her hand clenched around the Pikeville receipt in her pocket, her mind spinning at a speed she couldn't control. Voss knew she had been at the mansion. Voss knew she was digging deeper, and if Voss had been reckless enough to go beyond Henrik's orders 20 years ago, then he wasn't the kind of man who would sit still while a 27-year-old woman got close to the truth. When they reached the stable, Fletcher parked, shut off the engine, and stepped out. Security habit. He circled the area, checked the parking lot, checked the entrance, his eyes sweeping every corner. Josie got out of the SUV, watching Fletcher's broad back as he moved farther toward the side of the building to check the perimeter. As he turned his back, she remembered the heavy ring of keys she had spotted in his coat pocket when he drove to pick her up at the motel. As Fletcher turned to nod at her, Josie walked past him toward the stable entrance, deliberately brushing her shoulder against his, her fingers darting into his coat pocket with a line cook's practice speed to retrieve his car keys. Then she went into the stable, led Ghost out, quick but not rushed, coaxed the horse into the unusually spacious rear cargo area of Fletcher's heavy-duty SUV, climbed into the driver's seat, cranked the powerful engine, and drove out of the stable parking lot before Fletcher could even realize his keys were gone. In the rearview mirror, she saw Fletcher run out and stand in the gravel lot, watching the vehicle go, and Josie knew he didn't shout, didn't draw a gun, but his hand had pulled out his phone before her car disappeared behind the trees. 5 minutes. Josie gave herself 5 minutes before Knox knew. She drove onto the main road, turned north, toward the edge of Shelby County, toward Pikeville. The receipt in her shirt pocket held the address where the transport company had delivered something on the day her mother disappeared. And Josie was betting everything on one assumption. Catherine had hidden the evidence there before Voss intercepted her. She drove all night. The road was dark, traffic thin, the headlights cutting two narrow beams of light across the asphalt. Ghost stood in the rear of the SUV, silent, breathing steadily through the vent. Josie didn't turn on the radio, didn't turn on her phone because she knew Knox would call, and she didn't want to hear his voice right now. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew that if she heard him say, "Come back," one more time in that commanding, steel-cold voice, she might actually turn around. 3:00 in the morning, a gas station outside Pikeville. Josie parked beside the pump, turned off the engine, and sat still. Darkness surrounded her. The neon lights of the gas station flickered across the windshield. Blue-white, blue-white. She pulled from her bra pocket the piece of paper she had been carrying ever since the night she opened the jewelry box. Her mother's handwritten note, the creases softened from being read too many times. "If you find this, don't go looking for answers." Josie read that line and understood for the first time that it wasn't a warning. It was a plea, from a mother who knew the answer would hurt her child. And Josie wanted to stop. Truly wanted to stop. Not because she was afraid. Not because of the stranger's midnight call, or the business card on her windshield, or Fletcher pulling out his phone to call Knox as she drove away. But because she was tired, tired down to the bone. Tired from 20 years without a mother, 6 months without a father, and a week of not sleeping enough. Tired of having to be strong alone, always alone, from the 7-year-old child waiting by the door to the 27-year-old woman sitting in a mafia boss's borrowed vehicle at an empty gas station at 3:00 in the morning. She didn't know whether the truth was worth it, whether knowing exactly what had happened to her mother would be better than 20 years of vague hope that Catherine was still alive somewhere, still thinking of her, still wanting to come back, whether the truth would heal or only cut another wound into something already covered in scars. Josie closed her eyes, rested her head against the seat, and thought about starting the engine and driving back to Kentucky, back to the trailer park, back to the night shift at the diner if Rick would even take her back to the small, quiet life she had lived before. A crumpled $2 bill changed everything. Then she opened her eyes and looked into the rearview mirror. Ghost stood in the back of the SUV, her blind eyes staring into the dark, but her ears were pricked, listening. The bone-thin horse the whole world had said should be allowed to die. The horse Dr. Greer had called a body that hadn't agreed to lie down yet. The horse Josie had spent $2, 4 miles on foot, and everything she had to keep alive. The horse was standing in the back of the SUV at 3:00 in the morning, in the middle of nowhere, still breathing, still listening, still waiting for Josie to decide. Josie looked at Ghost, and understood. If she turned back now, she would live. She would be safe. She would keep existing in the trailer park with a question that would never be answered, the same way her father had existed for 20 years. But she wouldn't truly be alive, like Ghost before Josie bought her, standing trembling on the auction floor, waiting to die while no one cared enough to pay $5 for her. Existing wasn't living. "Mama told me not to open the door," Josie said to the rearview mirror, her voice hoarse inside the dark vehicle. "But you couldn't close it either, could you? You only ran." She folded the note, tucked it back into her bra pocket, started the engine, and drove out of the gas station toward Pikeville. Behind her, Ghost turned her ears toward the sound of the engine and stood steadier as the vehicle began to move, as if the blind horse knew too that they were headed in the right direction. Dawn in Pikeville was pale, gray, and cold, the light seeping out from behind low clouds, enough to see by but not enough to warm anything. Josie parked in front of the vacant lot beside the abandoned industrial park, led Ghost down, tied her lead to the base of the oak tree at the edge of the lot, and began searching. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She only knew that her mother had stopped here 20 years ago while running for her life and had hidden something before Voss intercepted her. She walked around the lot, her eyes sweeping the ground. Weeds, broken bricks, trash, nothing. The second round, slower, looking more carefully, nothing. The third, the fourth. The sun climbed higher, sweat gathered on Josie's skin, and her knees were scraped raw from kneeling to inspect every piece of concrete, every overturned tile. 2 hours. 3 hours. She was almost ready to give up. Then she stopped and thought the way her mother would have thought. Catherine at 29, running, with little time, afraid. She wouldn't dig a hole in the middle of an open lot. She would look for something already there, something naturally covered, something no one would notice. Josie looked around again, this time not at the ground but at the things lying on it. A slab of concrete in the western corner of the lot, beside a pile of broken bricks. Flat, about the size of a tabletop, cracked, moss growing along the edges. It looked like what remained of the floor of an old warehouse. Josie knelt, leaning close to the surface of the concrete. It took nearly a minute to find it because 20 years of rain and sun had almost erased it, but it was still there, faint, shallow, almost nothing more than a scratch. A small lily, carved with something sharp, hurried but clear, because the hand that had drawn it all her life. Catherine had marked it. Josie pushed the concrete slab aside. The soil beneath was softer than it should have been after 20 years, because the slab had shielded it from everything. Ghost drew in a sharp breath from the oak tree, stomping because of the smell of disturbed earth, and Josie whispered, "Quiet now," then kept digging. Digging with her hands, with her nails, with the pocket knife she had bought at a gas station. 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters. Her fingers touched something soft, slick, plastic. She pulled it up. A thick black plastic bag tied tightly with rubber bands, and inside it was a small dark brown leather handbag. Josie unzipped it. Inside, everything had been arranged neatly by the hands of someone who knew she might never come back for it. Identification papers under the name Catherine Wynne, a driver's license, a social security card, a new birth certificate, proof that Catherine had prepared everything before she ran. A small black notebook, dense with handwriting, columns of numbers, names, dates, the real ledger Catherine had copied from Harlan's office. A USB wrapped in 3 layers of Ziploc bags and then wrapped again in foil, so carefully that Josie could almost hear her mother's voice inside her head saying it had to be protected from moisture, from magnets, from everything. And at the bottom of the bag, folded in half, was a handwritten letter. Josie opened it, the same fine handwriting from the scrap of paper in the jewelry box, but shakier, more urgent. The writing of someone writing in darkness or through tears. "My Josie, if you find this, then I probably didn't make it out. The notebooks and the USB are evidence of what the Langford and Mercer families have done. I tried to do the right thing, but I was afraid for too long. Don't be afraid like your mother. Don't." The letter stopped there. Between the word "don't" and the blank space after it were 20 years of silence. Her mother hadn't had time to finish. Maybe she had heard a car coming. Maybe she had known time had run out, and she had run, and she hadn't escaped. Josie sat in the dirty earth in the middle of the abandoned Pikeville lot, the unfinished letter in her hand, and cried, for the first time since her father died. Not because of grief, but because at last, she knew. Her mother hadn't left. Her mother had written Josie's name in the most dangerous moment of her life, had tried to leave something behind for her daughter before the darkness swallowed her. Her mother had loved her. Ghost gave a soft whinny from the oak tree, the anxious sound of a horse hearing the person her trusted in pain. Josie wiped her eyes with the back of her dirt-stained hand, pressed the letter to her chest, and sat there until the tears ran dry. Then she carefully folded the letter, tucked it into the breast pocket of her shirt beside the scrap of paper from the jewelry box, slipped the leather handbag inside her coat, and stood up. And that was when she heard the sound behind her. Josie turned back. 2 men stood at the edge of the lot, about 20 meters away from her. They were dressed in black, wearing heavy jackets, their stances wide. The man on the right had one hand inside his jacket, positioned in a place Josie didn't need anyone to explain before she knew what he was touching. The taller man spoke in an even, ordinary voice, as if he were asking for directions. "Voss sends his regards." Josie didn't answer. Her body reacted before her mind could think, with the instinct of someone who had lived long enough in unsafe places to know that when people came looking for her somewhere no one could hear her scream, they hadn't come to talk. She shoved her mother's leather handbag deep inside her coat, pressing it against her stomach, her left hand gripping it tightly through the fabric. With her right hand, she pulled out her pocket knife, not to fight, but to cut the rein tying Ghost to the tree. One slice. The rope snapped. Ghost jerked her head up, ears pricked, sensing the sudden change in the air. And Josie ran. She didn't run toward the car, because the car was parked in the direction where the 2 men were blocking the way. She ran toward the abandoned industrial park, toward the rusted metal warehouses and rows of old containers. Ghost ran after her, her hooves clattering on the concrete, not needing to see, only needing to hear the sound of Josie's footsteps. Behind them, The footsteps of the two men followed, not running fast, but walking quickly. The walk of people who knew their prey had nowhere to go and didn't need to hurry. Josie rushed through the open space between two warehouses, turned left, then right. Ghost stumbled once, her front legs buckling, but he forced herself back up at once. Then came the shot, dry, sharp, echoing through the hollow space of the abandoned warehouses, bouncing off the metal walls until Josie couldn't tell where it had come from. She only knew it was close, and she only knew to run faster. Josie turned into the row of rusted containers, stacked in two lines on the east side, pulled Ghost in with her, moving deeper until she found a small gap between two containers placed unevenly, just wide enough for her and the horse. Josie stopped, her back against the cold wall of the container, her chest aching from breathing too hard. Ghost stood beside her, pressed close, breathing heavily but completely silent. No sound, no whinny, not a single noise, as if some instinct told him that right now silence meant survival. Josie pulled out her phone, its cracked screen smeared with mud, her hands shaking so badly she had to tap 3 times before it unlocked. She opened her photos, found the picture of the Mercer Holdings business card, zoomed in on the phone number, and called. Knox answered before the second ring. "Pikeville," Josie whispered. "The East Industrial Park. Voss's men." Silence for 1 second. 2 seconds. Then Knox's voice came through, cold and sharp as freshly honed steel. "Fletcher is 20 minutes from you. I'm on my way. Hold on." He hung up. Josie lowered the phone, slipped it into her pocket, and sat down on the cold concrete. Ghost stood beside her, her warm breath brushing through her hair. Outside, the footsteps of the two men rang across the cracked concrete. Closer, farther away, then closer again, searching through the maze of containers, and 20 minutes had never felt so long. The longest 20 minutes of Josie's life. She sat on the cold concrete in the narrow gap between two rusted containers, her back pressed against the sheet metal wall, her arms wrapped around Ghost's neck, counting every second in her head. Ghost stood beside her, pressed close, motionless, her ears stiff and alert, her breathing so slow it was almost impossible to hear. The blind horse had once learned how to stay silent in order to survive before Josie bought her, and now she was using that skill again. The footsteps of two men echoed through the maze of containers, near and then far, far and then near. They were narrowing the search, running out of corridors to check. At the 12th minute, the footsteps came so close that Josie could hear gravel grinding beneath the soles of their shoes, just outside the place where she was hiding. Josie held her breath, one hand resting lightly over her muzzle. The man passed by, slowly. Then his footsteps faded away. Josie breathed out through her nose, softly, not daring to breathe through her mouth. The 17th minute. A car. Not the sound of an ordinary car, but an engine coming fast over gravel, then braking, then a door opening, then silence. The kind of silence that had intention in it. Fletcher Dunn's silence. Josie saw nothing, only listened. She heard the two men stop, heard one of them say, "Who's there?" in a low voice. Then came a brief collision, the sound of someone falling onto concrete, Fletcher's sharp, quiet command, cutting through the air like an order that didn't need repeating. Fletcher didn't get into a gunfight. He moved around behind them, used surprise, restrained one man from the back before he could turn around. The second man heard it, panicked, and ran into the darkness of the industrial park, his footsteps crashing into a barrel with a metallic clang before disappearing. Then more cars, more of them. Headlights swept through the gap between the containers, white light slicing across the dark. Knox arrived with vehicles and men, footsteps spread out in different directions, organized, fast. The man who had run was stopped in the distance. The area was under control. Then a single set of footsteps entered the container corridor, slow, steady, the steps of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Knox turned into the opening. Josie looked up. He stood there in a black leather jacket, his hair slightly disheveled, his steel blue eyes scanning the darkness before stopping on her, taking in the sight of her sitting on the cold concrete, her face smeared with dirt and tear tracks, her arms wrapped around the blind horse's neck, her mother's leather handbag bulging beneath her coat. Knox said nothing. He walked over and sat down beside Josie, on the same concrete, his back against the same container wall. He took off his leather jacket and placed it over her shoulders. He didn't ask if she was cold, didn't ask if she was all right. He just sat there beside her in the dark. Josie trembled. Not from cold, not from fear, but from relief, because for the first time in 20 minutes, in 1 week, in 20 years, someone sat beside her and didn't say, "Go back," didn't say, "Stop." He was simply there. "I found it," Josie said, her voice hoarse. "The evidence. My mother hid it." She pulled the leather handbag out from beneath her coat and set it on her lap. "The real ledgers, the USB, and the letter my mother wrote to me. She wrote my name." Knox looked at the handbag, then at Josie, and in the faint light slipping through the gap between the containers, Josie saw something on Knox's face that she hadn't seen there before. Respect. Not politeness. The kind reserved for an equal. The kind Knox Mercer gave to the 27-year-old girl living in a trailer who had done what his entire organization had never dared to do, dug up the truth with her bare hands. Knox didn't take Josie away immediately. He sat beside her for a few more minutes in the darkness between the two containers, took out his phone, made a call, and said only 3 sentences in a low voice: "Pikeville, the Eastern Warehouse, and bring him here." Then he hung up and looked at Josie. "You stay here. You're not going anywhere else." This time, Josie nodded. She was too tired to have any strength left for stubbornness. 1 hour later, Fletcher dragged Sterling Voss into the warehouse. Voss hadn't come willingly. He was brought in with both hands held behind him, his silver hair fallen loose, his face red. Knox stood in the middle of the warehouse, hands in his trouser pockets, back straight, face without expression. Josie sat in the far corner on an old wooden crate, Ghost standing beside her, her mother's handbag still clutched in her lap. Voss saw Josie first. His eyes stopped on her, stopped on the leather bag across her thighs, and his face changed. Not fear, understanding. The understanding that the thing he had buried 20 years ago had just been dug up, and the person who dug it up was sitting 20 meters away from him, with gray-blue eyes, exactly like Catherine Langford's. Then Voss looked at Knox. "You're destroying everything your father built." Knox didn't move. "My father built on a rotten foundation. I won't continue it." "I protected this family for 30 years, Voss said, his voice rising, slipping out of control. "Catherine Langford was a threat. I did what had to be done." "My father ordered you to get her out of the region," Knox said, stepping 1 pace closer, and Voss stepped half a pace back even though someone was holding him from behind. The order was clear: no harm, underlined, repeated. You read it, and you chose to do the opposite. You made the decision yourself, and now you pay for that decision. Knox turned away, took out his phone, and made a second call. Almost 5 minutes, and Josie heard enough to know the person on the other end was a woman. Knox called her Walsh. Agent Priya Walsh, FBI agent, and from the way Knox spoke to her, from the familiarity in his voice, Josie understood this wasn't the first call between them. Knox had been in contact with the FBI for 2 years, ever since he inherited the Empire, and began his plan to dismantle it from the inside. Voss was the final piece, and Josie had given him that piece. 30 minutes later, 3 federal vehicles stopped in front of the industrial park. Walsh stepped out first, a woman around 40 years old, with short black hair, a sharp face, and a dark blue jacket with the letters FBI across the back. Knox handed everything over: Catherine's handwritten notebooks, the USB wrapped in foil, the files from Henrik's safe. He placed each thing on the temporary table in the middle of the warehouse, and Josie sat there watching the man at the head of the empire personally hand the weapons that would destroy his own empire over to the law. Voss was taken away by the agents. He didn't resist. He only looked at Knox as he passed, and Knox looked back without blinking. Knox stood outside the warehouse, watching the line of federal vehicles drive away. Josie stepped up beside him. "You just handed your organization over to the FBI," she said. "I handed over a deal," Knox said, his eyes still on the darkness. "Mercer Holdings will be dismantled under control. The employees, the people who earn their wages and know nothing about what's underneath, they'll be protected, transitioned. And you?" Knox was silent. "I accept the consequences." Josie looked at him. His shoulders were slightly bent now, no longer as straight as when Fletcher had stood behind him. He looked like a man who had just set down something he had carried for 3 years, and now didn't know what to do with his empty hands. She stood beside Knox in the darkness, Ghost standing behind them both, and all 3 of them looked into the empty space where the federal vehicles had disappeared, where 20 years of lies were beginning to collapse, slowly, steadily, like a brick wall falling one brick at a time. Voss confessed within 48 hours. Agent Walsh called Josie on the morning of the third day after the night at the Pikeville warehouse. Voss gave up the location. An old farm property under Mercer Holdings, about 20 minutes south of Pikeville. We're deploying the forensic team this morning. You don't need to be there. My mother was alone for 20 years, Josie said. I won't leave her alone for one more day. Josie drove to the property at 10 o'clock in the morning. The sky was clear, the wind steady, carrying the smell of dry grass and damp earth. The land sat between two hills, its wooden fence collapsed, weeds grown waist-high, the kind of land someone bought so no one else would ask questions, or bought to hide something no one was ever supposed to find. Federal vehicles were already parked along the dirt road. The forensic team, dressed in white, moved slowly, placing stakes, stretching tape, marking the area with small orange flags. Josie parked 50 meters away, led Ghost out, tied her lead loosely to the base of a large oak tree at the edge of the property, and stood there. She didn't go any closer, didn't step past the tape, didn't ask about progress. She only stood beneath the oak, her hand resting on Ghost's neck, and watched from a distance. She thought of Catherine at 29, running through the night with false papers and notebooks tucked inside her handbag, stopping in Pikeville to bury the evidence and carve a lily into the concrete surface, then continuing to run toward her daughter, toward Kentucky, running but never making it home. She thought of the unfinished letter. Don't be afraid like your mother. Don't. Josie would never know what the next word had been, but she knew her mother had written her name in the most dangerous moment of her life, and that was enough. Near noon, a forensic investigator stood up and said something into the radio. Walsh turned and looked toward Josie. Then she walked through the weeds, past the fallen fence, to the oak tree. She stopped 2 steps from Josie. Her face was softer, sadder than any time Josie had seen it before, in the way of someone who had done this work long enough to know there were no right words, but still had to speak. We found your mother. 5 words. Gentle, but heavier than anything Josie had ever heard in her life, because those 5 words were an ending, the final answer to the question she had carried for 20 years. Josie stood in the wind, her eyes dry. She didn't cry. She had cried enough in Pikeville. Now there was only a strange quiet, like after a storm has passed and everything has gone still. I found you, Mama, Josie whispered, her voice so small Walsh didn't hear it. Only Ghost did, the horse's ears turning toward her. 20 years late. But I found you. Ghost pressed his head against her shoulder, gently, slowly, the way this blind horse always did when she sensed Josie needed something words couldn't give. Josie placed her hand on Ghost's forehead and stood there in the wind until the forensic team finished, until they carefully lifted her mother from the place where she had lain alone for 20 years. She didn't go closer. She didn't need to see. She only needed to know. And now she knew. Josie buried her mother on a Saturday afternoon at the end of November, beside her father's grave, in the small cemetery on the edge of the Kentucky town where she had grown up. There was no grand funeral, no posture, only Josie standing before the newly dug grave, Ghost standing outside the fence with her ears pricked toward the wind, and Corbin Langford standing on the other side, crying. He had been crying since the small casket containing Catherine's remains was lowered into the ground, and he didn't stop. 20 years of silence, 20 years of knowing and not daring to speak, all broke open on one afternoon beneath the red maple trees. Josie didn't comfort him because she didn't know how, but she stood there and didn't leave, and maybe that was enough. Before leaving the cemetery, Josie saw a bouquet of white lilies leaning against Catherine's headstone. No card, no name, wrapped simply in brown paper. There was no black Bentley in the parking lot, but Josie knew who the flowers were from. The Voss trial took place 3 months later. Josie didn't attend. She had sent her statement to Walsh, 12 handwritten pages, and that was all she needed to contribute. Walsh called on the afternoon of the sentencing. 35 years, no parole. Josie thanked her, hung up, looked out the window, where Ghost was grazing in the late afternoon sun, and thought that 35 years couldn't make up for 20 years without her mother, but it ensured that Voss would never do the same thing to anyone else again. 6 months later, Josie didn't return to the trailer park. Corbin left her a small piece of land from the Langford estate, with a gentle hill, a little stream, and an old horse barn she repaired with her own hands. She accepted it not because of the money, but because it was land her mother had once belonged to. Ghost filled out, her coat growing thick and glossy, her steps steady. Her eyes were still blind, but the horse moved through the pasture as though she could see everything with other senses, with her ears, with her nose, with the memory of legs that had learned every tree root and stone on that land. One late summer afternoon, Josie was brushing Ghost in the barn when she heard a car. A low, smooth, familiar sound. The black Bentley stopped at the end of the road. Knox stepped out, and Josie almost didn't recognize him. No suit, no bodyguards, no Fletcher. A white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, jeans, walking shoes. He looked ordinary. He looked like a man who had taken off his armor along with his empire. And the thing beneath it wasn't a monster, but only a tired, relieved man walking toward her with the steps of someone who didn't know whether he would be welcomed, but had come anyway. Knox stopped at the fence, looked at Ghost, looked at Josie. Need help? Josie looked at him. Then she tossed him the second brush. Start on the right side. Ghost doesn't like anyone touching her left side first. Knox caught it cleanly, climbed over the fence, started brushing, awkwardly, clearly for the first time in his life. Ghost stood still, tossed her head lightly, then continued grazing. Accepted him, and for the first time, Josie saw Knox truly smile. Small, almost shy. The smile of someone standing exactly where he wanted to stand. They brushed Ghost in silence. The sun set behind the hill, staining the pasture orange. Ghost stood still between them, ears lifted, breath even, and Josie understood that some broken things couldn't be repaired back into what they once were. 20 years without her mother could never be taken back. But something new could be built from it. Not perfect, but enough. The $2 horse had brought her to the truth, to justice, and to the threshold of something she didn't yet dare to name. But for the first time in 20 years, she was no longer afraid to open that door. Josie's story is a reminder that sometimes the thing the world throws away is the very thing carrying the answer we've been searching for all our lives. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but being afraid and still taking the next step. That every human being, no matter how abandoned, no matter how unworthy of saving they've been made to feel, deserves to be seen and given a second chance. If this story touched you, please press like to support the channel so we can keep telling stories like this every day. Share this video with the people you think need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe now. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment, even just one line. I read every single line and hope to hear the feelings from deep within your heart. I wish everyone watching this video good health,